Hello and welcome to this 1000 subscriber special. In fact, looking at my daily updates from YouTube, this is probably going to end up as a 1,500 subscriber special, but who's counting? Thanks to everyone for subscribing and helping this channel grow over less than a year. Wow, it's amazing really. And also thank you to everyone for all your thoughtful and informed questions. As before, I've read them all and picked the most interesting to answer, and some of the answers are quite extended. So grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, a croissant, and let's get on with the show. Furry Popao asks, the 060 was the standard freight engine on English railways for many decades. But what, or who, cemented its popularity for the role? Is there a missing line all the way back to Hackworth's early engines? Or is there a missing link somewhere that the various locomotive superintendents all going, aha, this is the sort of engine we need? Well, the first 060 goods engine had been designed by George Stephenson. In fact, he had patented it in 1816. To be honest, every railway locomotive built before Planet of October 1830 was in effect a goods engine. Stephenson's 060 was also the first locomotive to use a crank axle, albeit unsuccessfully. Whilst Timothy Hackworth's heavyweight mineral locomotives in the Stockton and Darlington were successful in their own specialised evolutionary niche up in the northeast of England, there is in fact a missing link, and that is the Atlas, built by Robert Stephenson and Company in Newcastle, for the Leicester and Swannington Railway and delivered in February 1834. Atlas was derived from the large Samson type of locomotive, a locomotive rather like Lion, which was an 042. Essentially take away the two carrying wheels underneath the footplate, put on another pair of driving wheels and you have an 060. Atlas was the first modern, quote-unquote, six-coupled goods engine. She had cylinders 16 by 20 inches underneath the smoke box, driving a cranked axle. The driving wheels were 4 feet 6 inches and they were coupled using outside coupling rods. She weighed in at a colossal 17 tons without her tender, and she was probably the heaviest locomotive in existence at that time. Atlas was very successful in hauling heavy coal trains on the steeply graded Leicester and Swannington line, and two more followed, one by Charles Taylor of Newton-le-Willows and another by the Hague Foundry. And Atlas can be said to be the origin of the British inside cylinder 060 goods engine. There being very little difference between, say, Atlas or a 4F or even an Austerity. Big Little Railroad asks about improvements in tender design. The first big improvement was made by George Stephenson, who was the first to replace the wooden barrels in the tender like those on Rocket with an iron tank. This was then developed by Robert Stephenson into the first modern tender with an iron tank enclosing a space for the fuel, as well as sufficient room for a toolbox, snapbox and the crew. And the first modern tender probably was delivered with Planet in the October of 1830. Perhaps the biggest improvement to tender design comes just outside of my specialist period in the 1860s. When John Ramsbottom of the London and North Western Railway invented the water scoop to pick up water on the move from water troughs between the tracks on level stretches. This meant tenders didn't have to be quite so large and heavy in representing a dead weight to the train, and it also meant trains did not have to stop to replenish their water supply on the move. Brendan Scherf asked about the four-wheel leading truck or bogie. The bogie was a Welsh invention in the 18th century, and it was later patented by two English Quakers, the brothers William and Edward Chapman, in 1812, as part of their patent for a locomotive which pulled itself along a chain. Indeed, several locomotives were built with four-wheel bogies in the UK in the 1810s, including Puffing Billy. The first modern quote-unquote bogie engines in the UK were imports from the United States by Norris. They were intended for use on the very steep Lickey Incline on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, and you can find out more about them in reading the Reverend Wilbert Audrey's book on the Birmingham and Gloucester. British builders built copies of them, but they were pretty much one-offs, built for a special duty on the Lickey Incline. And they were one-offs especially since many of Norris's claims about the hill-climbing ability of his locomotives were subsequently shown to be completely fraudulent. The next mainline locomotive with the leading bogie was Archibald Sturrock's Unique 215, which was built as a fixed wheelbase 8-wheeler, but she was very quickly rebuilt with a leading bogie to help her take curves at speed. Leading bogies became more popular in the 1870s, and we just have to think of Patrick Stirling's magnificent 8-foot singles, as locomotive speeds became higher and trains became heavier. The main reason in Britain we stuck with fixed wheelbase locomotives compared to the United States was due to British track being of a far higher quality, having far gentler curves and gradients. There was simply no need for them with a straight, flat, high-quality permanent way in Britain. Chris Eden Green asks, what are your thoughts on Brunel's atmospheric system? If it were built today, do you believe such a system would work as he designed it? I've spent a lot of time researching this, and my thoughts have swung between saying yes, it was brilliant and no, it was an awful load of rubbish. But after inwardly digesting all of this, my thoughts pretty much echo those of George Stephenson. It was a humbug. There had been attempts at atmospheric railways from the 1820s, including something like a pneumatic tube firing a train down a giant pneumatic pipe, but none of them really worked. The Chemin de Fer de Paris Saint-Germain was quite successful in adopting the technology, adopting it in 1847 as a stopgap technology, as locomotives then couldn't climb the steep incline into Saint-Germain, but as soon as locomotives sufficiently powerful came along, it was discarded in 1854. It was a very clever idea, but the technology wasn't simply there, and I don't think it is there today to work as Brunel envisaged it, because of the problems with the continuous valve on top of the atmospheric tube. And that's before any problems of points or crossovers etc. are taken into consideration. Will Power asks, what's the deal with early American copyright infringement and pirating of early Planet and other types during the early days of steam? To put it very bluntly, American engineers just didn't care. International copyright and patent laws were pretty weak at the time. Incidentally, American patent law was based on getting your patent enrolled first, irrespective of whether the idea was actually original or whether it was yours. You only have to look at the controversies over the invention of the light bulb or the telephone. In Britain, patent law was based on showing originality of design, as well as having the idea first. But as Boulton and Watt discovered, patents could be written in such a way so that they were able to patent the entire concept of the steam engine for 50 years, and then sue anybody who built a steam engine for patent infringement. Robert Stephenson rather foolishly never took out a patent for Planet, but it was produced under license by other manufacturers, largely through a series of gentlemen's agreements. They were built, for example, by Charles Taylor at the Vulcan Foundry, or by Fenton, Murray and Wood, latterly Fenton, Murray and Jackson, in Leeds. And they were produced using drawings and specifications provided by Stephenson, so long as these other manufacturers did not claim the design was theirs. The French were able to circumvent patent designs by importing a small number of patent-designed machinery as educational models to study. It was then perfectly legal to make a copy of the original machine or locomotive, plus one or two improvements, so long as no one tried to claim a patent on it in France. So whilst American engineers didn't break patent law by building pirated versions of the Planet, they did indulge in intellectual theft. Some American locomotive builders even had the temerity to write Robert Stephenson to tell him they were copying his designs. His replies, however, have thus far not come to light. BP and SD asks, what rolling stock did Rocket haul in the Rainhill trials? Were the bright yellow coaches in the Hornby models ever used in the Liverpool and Manchester Railway? Didn't a single artist attend the Rainhill trials? So to start with your third point first, Sadly, there are no known contemporary depictions of the Rainhill trials. All existing drawings, etc. are much, much later. The rolling stock used at the Rainhill trials were simple goods wagons. They were about 10 feet long with short removable sides known as crib rails so they could be filled with stones. They weighed about 2 tons, were carried on cast iron wheels 3 feet in diameter and had handbrakes. They could carry about 2 tons, and in fact the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Act stipulated that no laden rail vehicle could weigh more than 4 tons. There was a single passenger carriage in use at the Rainhill trials. It was one of the blue second-class carriages, and this was used to carry the judges, the company directors and other VIPs to and from the trials, hauled of course by the Rocket. To answer your question about yellow coaches, yes, the Liverpool and Manchester did run yellow coaches, and they were the first class or enclosed, or as they were at the time, glass coaches. But they were not the bright yellow of the Hornby models. They were officially painted deep chrome yellow, and after several coats of vegetable-based varnish, the resulting colour would have been more mustardy. As a rather long aside, the Hornby models are in fact not models of Liverpool and Manchester carriages. There are no known works drawings for Liverpool and Manchester carriages full stop. The Hornby models instead are models of replica carriages built by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway in 1930 as part of the centenary celebrations of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and they were designed and scaled to run and look right behind the restored Lion. They were built by the LMS at Derby using second-hand materials as cheaply as possible, and it's amazing they have lasted nearly 100 years. The 1930 replicas are based on a model made by the London and North Western Railway in 1911, and this model is now in the National Railway Museum in York. This 1911 model was made as a replacement for an original model built in 1838 by Thomas Worsdale of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Carriage Department. It was made as an example to be copied by other carriage builders who were tendering to supply carriages to the London and Birmingham Railway, and therefore may not have represented Liverpool and Manchester practice. It was sadly lost in a fire in 1910. The 1930 replicas differ in several respects from the 1911 model, which in turn differs from the 1838 original model upon which the 1911 model was supposedly based. Even more confusingly, a set of drawings made by the LNWR in the 1890s, supposedly based on the 1838 model, differs from the 1838 model compared with photographs of it. The Hornby models differ from the 1838 model and the 1930s replicas by being fitted with oil lamps on the carriage roofs. Oil lamps on the roof are something which the original Liverpool and Manchester carriages didn't have, but are a feature of the 1911 model. It's all a bit confusing, but in essence the Hornby models are models of the 1930 replicas. Similarly, the blue third-class carriages made by Hornby are models of the 1930 replica carriages. 3 first-class and 3 third-class, as they were described at the time, were made by the LMS. The Liverpool and Manchester didn't run third class until 1844, which was 10 years after Rocket had left revenue-earning service. Furthermore, the third-class carriages on the Liverpool and Manchester were old second-class carriages which had been downgraded. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway never ran carriages as crewed with no seats. Their second-class carriages had seats with space for luggage underneath them, and they were of course fitted with roofs. As a shameless plug, you can find out more about Liverpool and Manchester carriages in my forthcoming book, Locomotives of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, coming this month from Pen and Sword Transport. Continuing the Rainhill theme, Martin Chalimoniuk, and I hope I have pronounced that correctly, asks about the Novelty, and what would have happened if Novelty had won. I think it would have been extremely unlikely that Novelty could have won at Rainhill. As George Stephenson said of her at the time, she had no guts and suffered from too much ingenuity. Novelty, like Sans-Pareil of Timothy Hackworth, was a culminant point of the technology she was built with and represented. It was very hard, if not impossible, to develop the design further in terms of size, power, speed and efficiency. But supposing she had won, Novelty would very soon have been made obsolete by rocket-type locomotives. She would have been too small and lightweight to have pulled long, heavy trains. She'd have been able to pull a couple of carriages or a couple of lightly loaded goods wagons, and that would have been it. So there would have been lots of small, light, frequent trains running in quick succession, and I'm not sure that would have led to any meaningful development of the railway. Henna 4472 asks about the Quakers and their involvement in the early railways and locomotives, and whether there was any specific reason for it. The answer is yes, and sadly it's due to discrimination. And it's because of Britain, specifically England, having an established church, i.e. having a state religion. To cut a complicated story short, unless you were a member of the Church of England and one who took communion, you effectively had no civil rights. The law meant that only Anglicans, i.e. members of the Church of England, could attend university in England. The Scottish universities didn't have a religious test, however. It also meant you couldn't be educated at a parish school. You couldn't train to be a lawyer or a teacher or other professions, or even be an army officer. Not that a pacifist Quaker would join the armed forces, of course. Being a non-Anglican also restricted admission to the ancient guilds which controlled the major crafts. Even worse, the law said that everyone had to be baptised, married and buried in their parish church according to the rites and customs of the Church of England, even if you weren't a member and didn't believe it. It wasn't until 1836 that non-Anglicans could marry in their own places of worship, but with permission from the Anglican bishop, of course. This all meant that the Quakers and other kindred groups like the Unitarians were discriminated against, and thus they had to look within their own communities for support. They organised their own schools and colleges. Robert Stevenson attended a Unitarian college in Newcastle, for example, and later went to the University of Edinburgh, not only because it was local, but because there was no religious test for admission. Quakers primarily looked to business as a means of getting on, starting their own companies and working for and doing business with each other. Quaker companies employing other Quakers. The new railways came along and they had none of the ancient guilds attached to them. They were yet to be professionalised, with the concomitant links to the establishment with a capital E that brought. So the railways were ripe for exploitation by people like the Quakers and the Unitarians. The railways were a new field, a new industry, which meant that the Unitarians and Quakers could flourish without any links or interference from the establishment. They could mark it out as their own territory and do their own thing. Happily, most of the legal impediments to non-Anglicans in England were repealed in 1828, but it wasn't until 1855, as late as that non-Anglicans could go to Oxford or Cambridge to study as undergraduates, and shockingly enough, it wasn't until the 20th century that a non-Anglican could study for a PhD at Oxford or Cambridge. That's been quite a long answer, quite an involved one, but I hope that's answered your question. Lots of you have been asking about American locomotives. Yes, I'm going to do them, but at the moment I can't travel to do research or get photographs or videos of them. If you would like to help by supplying photographs, that would be fantastic. Kabuki Kitsune asked about Webb's successful compound locomotives with duplex drives. Yes, they are going to appear in one of my Victoriana videos. They are really interesting locomotives, and ones about which an awful lot of myths, and for the want of an expression, fake news has arisen, so there'll be plenty of myth busting. Finally, as to the future of this channel, I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing, but I have also started a Patreon to help develop this channel further and to improve the content I put out, so I can give you more of what you like. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and that I have answered as many of your questions in as much detail, and perhaps maybe too much detail, as possible. If you have any more questions or queries, pop them in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going there. Thank you all for subscribing to this channel, and see you next time on Rail Story.